Informed Choice Radio, episode 415, Rewilding Knepp Castle with Isabella Tree.
Recorded live from Cranley in Surrey. This is Informed Choice Radio. Want to make the most of your money and your life? You've come to the right place. Here at Informed Choice, we believe that when it comes to your money, the more you know, the faster it can grow. Now, here's your host, Chartered Financial Planner, Martin Bamford.
What happens when an intensively farmed estate is handed back to nature? In this episode of Informed Choice Radio, something a little different. I recently had the opportunity to speak to the award-winning nature and travel journalist Isabella Tree about the Knepp Experiment. Isabella, along with her husband, the environmentalist Charlie Burrell, are custodians of the 3,500-acre Knepp Castle Estate in West Sussex. She's author of the acclaimed book Rewilding, The Return of Nature to a British Farm. In Rewilding, Isabella tells the story of the Knepp Experiment, a pioneering rewilding project in West Sussex using free-roaming grazing animals to create new habitats for wildlife. Part gripping memoir, part fascinating account of the ecology of our countryside, Rewilding is, above all, an inspiring story of hope. So how did this interview come about? Well, a while ago, Nick went on a butterfly safari at Knepp. He often talks to his clients about it, and recently we purchased a few copies of Rewilding for some clients of Informed Choice. Nick then suggested we approach Isabella to ask if she would join us on this podcast. From a personal perspective too, as chairman of the Knoll Park Trust, I was particularly interested to learn more about the role of humans in encouraging and supporting wildlife in a particular area. There is, of course, a personal finance angle here too. As you'll hear in this episode, Izzy and Charlie were massively in debt when they made the decision to rewild Knepp. The transformation of their farm has created some interesting new revenue streams and also some fantastic employment opportunities. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Isabella Tree, author of Rewilding. So welcome back to Informed Choice Radio. I'm delighted today to welcome Isabella Tree. So Isabella, perhaps you could start by introducing yourself. Tell us a bit about who you are and what you do.
I own Knepp Castle Estate with my husband Charlie Burrell, who is now a conservationist, though he was very much a farmer when we took over in the 1980s. And I've recently just written a book about our experiences of being farmers and then turning to this complete sort of revolution of doing rewilding. And it's called Rewilding, and it's had this incredible response, which has been really exciting because I think it's really demonstrating how people out there are changing the way they look at the landscape and what it can do for us.
And before we started recording, you mentioned it's getting a great response, not just from the people you might expect it to, the bird watchers, the ecologists, but from people in other sectors too.
Absolutely, and I think that is where the real kind of positive message is, because the interest is coming from landowners and increasingly from farmers actually facing, Brexit and the uncertainty of farming subsidies being shaken up. So it's really land managers who are looking at what we've done at Knepp as a model for doing something radically different with their own land that can provide all sorts of different services and, of course, fantastic improvements in biodiversity.
So for listeners who are not familiar with the story of the Knepp Experiment, can you tell us a bit about how it got started? What's the background?
Yes, we inherited this estate, Knepp Castle Estate. It's 3,500 acres, about 44 miles south of central London, in the early 1980s from my husband Charlie's grandparents. And it was a very intensively managed arable and dairy farm. Almost every inch had been ploughed up during the Second World War, during the Dig for Victory. Any available land that could be farmed was farmed. And it had just carried on in that vein, really driven by farming subsidies. But when we inherited it in the 1980s, it was already a failing business, losing money hand over fist. And we assumed, I suppose, with the sort of arrogance of youth, that this was because his grandparents hadn't invested in infrastructure and didn't really know the latest technologies, all of which was true. But after 17 years, we realized that actually it was the land. It's this heavy Sussex clay that just makes us completely uncompetitive in farming terms. I mean, in a wet winter, you can't get heavy machinery onto the land sometimes for 6 months, which means that you can't sow spring crops. Basically, you can't compete with lovely loamy soils and bigger, more intensive farms elsewhere. So 17 years on, 2000, we decided we had to sell the farm. Not the land, but we had to stop farming. We were £1.5 million in debt, and it was just going to get worse. And so Charlie made the decision, and it was a very, very black day. I remember it well. He had to make the farm manager redundant, who was a good friend, and 10 farm workers. And we sold 3 beautiful Holstein dairy cows, some of the best herds in Britain, and all our farm machinery. But what we had decided was that we really had to start doing something with the land rather than battling against it all the time. And that's when we hit upon this idea of turning it over to nature, but doing it in a very radical way and allowing free-roaming animals to do the management of the area for us.
It's a fantastic turnaround, and it must have felt like a very different purpose at that point.
It did. I mean, we didn't do it all in one go. We weren't that brave. We had we restored the park around the house, a lovely old Repton Park, which had probably until 1939 never been ploughed in its life, but it'd been growing crops ever since. And we got some funding from Countryside Stewardship Scheme to restore the park around the house. And that really gave us the germ of this idea, because suddenly we were opening our doors onto the surround sound of insects, and we hadn't even realized that we were missing that sound. And of course, you could walk knee deep through wildflowers and native grasses and just be kicking up grasshoppers and common blue butterflies. And then, of course, the birds started coming back. And we thought, this is astonishing. If we can do something so quickly as this, if we could actually put in some big, heavy-hitting disturbers and drive the habitat even more, with even more complexity and interest, we could have some really, really astonishing results. And that's what's happened.
How much human intervention does nature need? Is it a case of just leaving the land to sort of take itself back to nature, or are there things that you're intervening and doing to almost act as a catalyst, I guess?
Yes, I mean that's exactly the question. That's the key question. And so what any farmer or landowner or gardener even knows, if you leave a piece of land just to its own devices, it scrubs up and then it turns eventually into closed canopy woodland, which is very species poor. It's very undynamic. It's really a habitat, once it's closed canopy, that's only really good for fungi, and that's pretty much it. There's only a handful of bird species that live in closed canopy woodland. So what we were really excited by was the work of this Dutch ecologist called Frans Vera, who wrote this book that was translated into English exactly the year that we sold up. We stopped farming. And it's called Grazing, Ecology and Forest History. And what he's saying is that in all our imaginings of how temperate zone Europe would have looked, we've completely forgotten about the huge herds of roaming animals that would have been here. So we've forgotten about tarpan, the original horse. We've forgotten about aurochs, the original cow. We've forgotten about bison, about elk, about wild boar, and beavers by the millions. And all these would have been creating a much more complex, open mosaic of habitats, completely different to the closed canopy forest that we kind of often have in our heads. So if you want to do something interesting for biodiversity, you've got to put these drivers in. Let those free-roaming animals disturb, trample, rootle, snap branches, all that, the way the dung works with the soil, all that kicks off biodiversity. So that's what we did, really, was introduce these free-roaming animals and let them drive the habitats for us. And of course you can't introduce an aurochs or a tarpan because we hunted them to extinction, but we do have their descendants. So we use Old English longhorns as an aurochs, and we have Exmoor ponies being a tarpan, and Tamworth pigs being a wild boar, and red deer and fallow deer as well. And so all these grazers and browsers have their own different preferences of what they want to eat, different behaviours, their disturbance is completely different, and they all open up niches for all sorts of other life.
And some of the species you mentioned there are obviously animals you've introduced to the land. Were others species that came naturally once the land was available for them?
Yeah, so in terms of management, all we do is put these free-roaming animals into the landscape and let them get on with it. The only management we do is keep an eye on the numbers. So if you just continue letting them breed, obviously you'll get a problem of overgrazing. What you want is a kind of interesting battle between animal disturbance and the vegetation succession, all this thorny scrub coming up. That's what creates all the mosaics in different habitats. So those grazing and browsing animals are the only things we've introduced to the project. Everything else has just come back because the habitat has come back. So now we've got, some of the rarest species, not just in Britain, but in Europe. I mean, we've got turtle doves, we've got nightingales, cuckoos, which are almost disappearing from the UK, and we've got 13 out of the 18 UK species of bat. One of them, called the Becksteins, is rare even in Europe. And this is why it's so astonishing. This is in less than 20 years on land that was severely depleted post-agricultural farmland underneath the Gatwick stacking system. So, I mean, if it can happen here, it can happen anywhere.
No, that's an incredible turnaround, isn't it? Now, this is a personal finance podcast, as you know, so I need to ask you about some of the sort of more financial economic aspects of this. You mentioned at the time, I think you said you were £1.5 million in debt back in 2000. So what's the economic and financial benefit of moving from intensive dairy and arable farming to a rewilding project like this?
Well, I mean, just stopping farming cleared our debts. So, we sold the farm machinery, we sold the herds, and luckily, my husband's timing was absolutely spot on. His decision it was when milk quota was at its highest, and it crashed the following year. So we were very lucky, cleared our debts. Now we have three main income streams. One is from ecotourism, because now we have so much wildlife here to see that we've got there's huge demand from people wanting to come and see it. So we run sort of African-style safaris with professional ecologists who act as guides. And we have a kind of glamping site, which is again based like an African safari, and a campsite. And that really was inspired by the thought that you just don't have to travel to the ends of the earth like we used to do to see wildlife. We've got really exotic, beautiful wildlife in our own backyard. So that ecotourism business, that ecotourism business probably brings in, I think last year, about 320,000, of which 20%, we make a margin of about 20% on that. And then we have meat sales. So from the culling of our free-roaming herds, we sell venison, beef, and pork, about 75 tons of that a year, which brings in about 120,000. And I think we hope that once we're selling that direct to the public, we can at least triple that once we can actually sell direct through mail order. And also we're going to be setting up a charcuterie. And really, I think there's a big demand now, especially with the sort of vegan movement, and we're all thinking more, ethically about what we eat, for meat that is grown as naturally as possible and that is as good, healthy for the animals and healthy for us, and then on top of that, sustainable and positive for the environment. So we think that that's going to be a growing income stream for us. And then, of course, we've got all these agricultural buildings, which before were just costing us an arm and a leg to maintain. And now we can, with a bit of capital outlay, we are now, we've developed them, or I think half of them, but it's an ongoing process, but into office space, storage, light industrial use. And so those buildings on their own, they're separate businesses from us, but they're employing 200 people. So that's bringing 200 people back into a rural environment to work. So, the positive spin-offs are huge, really.
Yeah, that's an incredible sort of comparison. And you mentioned having to lay off, I think, 10 farm workers back when that decision was made. But to go from 10 people employed in that's very local economy to 200 is just incredible.
Yes, I mean, those are other businesses, obviously, who are bringing those in. But we are beginning to employ again, too, but in a different way. So managing the farm animals now only takes one person. And he has a bit of extra help if we're doing TB testing or all the other sort of regulations we have to comply with. But we're now employing campsite managers, cleaners, staff who provide food for our events. We have numerous NGOs who come and visit us and look at Knepp as a model for their own land management. So they come on AGMs and workshop days, so we provide catering for them. We have 2 or 3 permanent guides and ecologists, and we also employ probably 7 or 8 now part-time ecologists. So it's growing all the time.
Yeah, fantastic. Obviously, farming subsidies is a hot topic at the moment, given the continued uncertainty around Brexit. And by the sounds of it, subsidies and the timing of your decision was one factor in making this a success. Do you think that rewilding can help to address some of the concerns that farmers might have around the loss of EU farming subsidies, or at least the uncertainty around that?
I hope so. I think the signs from Michael Gove, at least, are very good. We know that the basic farm payment, the basic payment, is going to go, and rightly so. I don't think we should be paid for just simply owning land. But the signs are that the higher level stewardship kind of agri-environment scheme funding will continue, perhaps in a different way. I think in the agricultural bill it's called Environment Land Management Scheme, and that will start paying land managers for things like soil restoration, for water purification, water storage, flood mitigation, carbon sequestration, all those public goods that we desperately need. So farmers or land managers won't be paid simply for producing food to the detriment of everything else. All these things will come into play. So ways of managing your land, and particularly something like rewilding, which can have so many positive benefits in terms of public goods, as they're now called, or ecosystem services, are huge. I mean, we've just done some research, and we know that we've doubled the carbon in our soils. We've tripled the microbiota, the soil biota in the soils. We've tripled the mycorrhizae. So we know that our soils are coming back, and this is absolutely vital if we're going to carry on farming not just sustainably but regeneratively. Because the UN brought out a report recently saying that the planet has only 60 harvests left before the topsoil is gone, and there's nothing to plant anything in. Wow. So we have to change the way we look at farming. We've got to look at how we bring back our soils and deepen our soils. And we've shown that within 20 years, the soils can bounce back if you are using free-roaming animals like this, and all the dung, the urine, all the disturbance, and the opportunities that can come back to revitalise the soil. So I think the signs are good, but it's still so many question marks out there about how this will be measured, how it will be, enforced, how it will actually work. But at least the sense of direction, I think, is really positive.
And what does the future hold for the Knepp estate?
Well, the wonderful thing about a rewilding project is it is targetless. I mean, you don't have any goals or expectations. It's completely unlike conventional conservation. So we really sit back and wait and see what happens, and all sorts of things happen all the time. I mean, we had goshawks the other day. We hadn't seen them ever before. We've got peregrine falcons nesting in a tree. In the long term, I think we would love to link up with some of the landowners around us, and I think we're already in the country seeing that happening, farm clusters getting together, of farmers grouping together to do landscape restoration projects like this. we've already got a farmer who's put in 500 acres, but we'd love to eventually convince landowners between us and the sea that we could connect one day with the sea again and have our old English longhorns, our proxy aurochs, grazing on sallow at Knepp 1 week and then on the beach at Shoreham eating seaweed.
Now, there's a sight. I'd love to see that. That'd be wonderful. Isabella, thank you so much for your time today. Before I let you go, where can we find out more about Knepp and also get hold of a copy of your book?
Well, the book is Waterstone's Book of the Month, this month, April, so it's in bookshops. And if you want to come and visit Knepp or see what we're about, it's www.kneppsafaris.co.uk.
Fantastic. I'll make sure I put a link in
and
the show.
Knepp with a
K. Yes.
Yeah, with a K, exactly. Yeah.
I'll make sure I put links in the show notes for the book and for the website so people can find that nice and easily. Thank you so much for your time. That was fascinating.
Not a bit.
A big thank you to Isabella for joining us for this episode of Informed Choice Radio. I highly recommend her book, Wilding. It's well worth a read. You can also find out more about Knepp at their website, which is kneppsafaris.co.uk, Knepp spelt K-N-E-P-P. I'll put links for this episode in the show notes. That's icradio.co.uk. Until next time, I'm Martin Bamford, and this is Informed Choice Radio. And remember, when it comes to your money, the more you know, the faster it can grow.